So, I want to talk about a book today. And that book is Ghostland, An American History and Haunted Places by Colin Dickey. The ghost book I was not expecting to get. I was expecting this book. I actually picked it up from Book Outlet, a fantastic online website where you can get books at discounts. This is not an ad for them. It's just me saying it because I really like Book Outlet. I picked up Ghostland because I thought, haunted places, I can freak myself out, especially when I'm the only one living in my apartment now and all the sounds scare me, right? That's not quite what I got here today. And as always, my co-star Tigris is here as well. Don't mind her, she's just a ghost. Not really, but she's fine. Ghostland is, like I said, not the book I was expecting to get. I was fully expecting, a book about ghosts. Like one that compiled a bunch of stories about really haunted places in America. This kind of does, but it's actually far more critical of these stories than I thought. And not like scientifically explaining why ghosts can't possibly exist. No, I mean taking a look at the cultural reasons why we might have ghost stories, why these certain places might be haunted, and then all of the other issues surrounding it. I'm talking about sexism, racism, classism, and all that fun jazz. What do I mean? Well, this book is a fascinating dive into ghost stories in their modern format and how they actually got to this point. So while it starts out with the broad idea that ghost stories are stories about our history and parts of history we want to keep alive, it actually does a very good job in exploring other reasons why we might tell these specific stories. For example, the racism side. This is a fantastic question that I never thought of when it comes to ghost stories. For example, we tend to clean things up, and that's another big point that Dickey makes in this book. We tend to tell the nice stories when we talk about ghost stories. And while these stories can be absolutely brutal and insane, they're usually made that way so that we can feel better about ourselves. For example, Dickey actually talks about this one house that's haunted by the female owner of the house that used to brutalize her slaves. This is historically a thing that is true. Dickey does a very good job in saying whether or not he can find historical accounts of these people and these events that are supposedly then haunting the area. And this woman did in fact torture her slaves, to the point where one of them set the house and slave quarters on fire to sort of put them out of their misery. Thankfully, the fire was actually put out and the community rescued these people and freed them from this woman, but ultimately the ghost story that's told makes this even worse. This is not just a white woman who used to own slaves and treat them brutally like many white owners did. This is a crazy woman whose color doesn't matter because she did insane things, like completely torture people by skinning them alive. Why do we tell stories like that? Well, like I said, it's to make us feel better about ourselves. The brutalization of black bodies was a historical thing, but hey, if we just make the ghost story about it, about this one crazy lady who did unbelievable evil things, then we tend to ignore all of the other people who did less awful things, but still awful things, because that was just how they acted at the time. It might have been wrong, but not as wrong as that crazy lady over there. So she's the one haunting the area. Dickey also does a very good job of pointing out how this actually tends to polarize. We either get really insane stories that involve these questions of racism and sexism that sort of put it on the crazy end over here, or we tend to try and erase it entirely. In fact, he does a deep dive into a city that had one of the largest black slave markets in America. It's very haunted, supposedly, but it's all white ghosts. It's all tavern owners and prostitutes. and high-end escorts who are just hanging around laughing and touching people. It's not about the black bodies that used to exist in this space that were brutalized, sold, or killed there. That's not a story we want to keep in mind because it's a history we want to have go away. So those ghosts simply don't exist. Additionally, he also brings up the fact that there are stories that different communities tell based on historical lessons they had to take into account. The one that stuck with me the most was actually a story about wagons that would appear and disappear out of nowhere. This type of story about bloody bones and rattling skulls was told to black children because those wagons were often white folks who were there to kidnap unattended children and sell them into slavery. So the ghost stories started around them to prevent that from happening, to keep the kids away from the wagons so that they didn't disappear and add to the ghost stories. And the real history, of course. That is the super fascinating thing about Ghostland. It's not just about the ghost stories, it's about the reasons behind them. Are we seeing racism still affecting our world? How it used to affect us, and how we're trying to get rid of that history or soften it by creating different ghosts. The same is true with sexism. There are a couple women in here, especially when combined with classism, that go a little weird. For example, the slave owner who, well, became the psychopath. Because not all white slave owners did horrible things to their black servants who were slaves and didn't have a choice. Additionally, one of the very first chapters that actually caught my eye was about the Winchester Mystery Mansion. That whole story about Mrs. Winchester building this mansion because she had been told that she was being haunted by the ghost killed by the Winchester rifle, and if she ever stopped building the mansion, they would find her and kill her. No! It turns out that entire history is a false one. They say that she had nightly midnight seances in a specific room, but if you actually look historically at what that room was used for, it was her gardener's bedroom. There are letters by Mrs. Winchester that prove that she was of perfectly sound mind and was simply a rich woman who was by herself at that point, originally was building the house so that her sisters and their families could live there, and then ultimately just deciding she enjoyed doing it and wanted to try new designs. For example, she writes at one point about how she had to change the design because the room ended up having no exterior lights and windows, so she wanted to put a skylight in. This was just a rich woman who had time and money on her hands and was experimenting in an architecture that was male dominated. So ultimately, where all these crazy rumors about her come from is the community simply seeing an outsider. They're seeing the abnormality of a rich woman doing a manly passion and finding it weird. The stories just took off from there, especially when you add in that the house ultimately ended up looking strange. It is this fascinating dive into all the weird things about ghosts that aren't a question of whether or not they exist. Colin Dickey does wonder, and throughout the book he does actually talk with people who believe in ghosts. He talks with paranormal experts and ghost hunters, and he tries to understand the fascination with the afterlife, for both the afterlife's sake, but also the cultural connections. What stories are we telling and why? And he does ask some really hard questions, and not just about our history. Towards the end, he actually brings up more modern ghosts. For example, one young woman who had been kidnapped and murdered, and a ghost story spread from it. Likely it started very similarly to the story about the wagons, a warning to keep people away from the area that she originally went missing in, which at the time hadn't been well occupied. But there's the other side of it. Her family's still alive. How do they feel about their daughter becoming a ghost story? About becoming something that can't leave our world? And, truth be told, is then, well, limited to her horrific ending. You had to have known her for her to be anything else but a ghost now, and how fair is that to her, her memory, and her living family? Ultimately, Dickey does a fantastic job in setting up the question of why we talk about ghosts in the way that we do. And it's not always a good thing. He really, really does critique ghost tourism. The question of going someplace purely for the horrific, haunting stories of the place. The other term I've heard for this is dark tourism, but that tends to include far more than just ghost stories. For example, fascinations with prisons, even if you don't believe in the supernatural. And asylums, same thing. But ghost tourism often tends to include those things. And in fact, Dickey does. But it is a question of why we are so absolutely fascinated with these stories to the point that we'll screw up the entire history in order to talk about them. There's no easy answer either. Dickey never decides one way or another if any of this stuff is good or bad. He just tends to raise the question. He'll admit fully when he's had his own experiences, and he's been to a lot of the places he mentions. Even if he hasn't experienced ghost encounters themselves, he does fully admit a lot of places give off weird feelings, and we tend to develop those into more than just feelings. The other thing I absolutely love about this book that took me a while to really realize is how it's actually organized. So what Dickey's done is set up a division in his stories. So part 1 is called The Unhomely, and it focuses on houses and mansions. Then After Hours, looking at bars, restaurants, hotels, and brothels. Then the Civic-Minded Spirits, looking at prisons, asylums, graveyards, and cemeteries, and a park. And Useless Memory, which looks at cities and towns. This setup actually turned out to really help hold the book together, because it starts very small, and then gets broader and broader as we go through. But because he set it up this way, you're following the argument he's setting up, which is a lot of questions about the cultural identity of ghosts and why we continue to tell their stories, as they get broader and broader. If he started with just haunted cities in general, it would have been far too broad for us to understand. Instead, he starts with the smallest one, and the one most of us are more likely to have experienced. If you've experienced a ghost encounter, it's more likely in some place that you've spent a lot of time. A house. And oftentimes is going to be a very meaningful encounter to you because it is a personal experience. But then Dickey takes time to draw everything out. He gets the arguments in bigger and bigger terms until suddenly you can understand how we have ghosts at the level of cities and towns and not just individual spaces, and how our relationship with those spirits tends to change. We tend to start with a lot of the stories of individual people at the beginning. For example, one of the very first ones he tells is about a house in Salem, Massachusetts, and the connection it had with one of the victims of the witch trials. This is an individual story, and a very common one that a lot of people are going to know about. That's also the section that the Winchester Mansion is mentioned in. Common stories that people recognize, but don't always understand the historical truth behind. And once that's cleared up, Dickey's able to broaden the understanding to places like, well, hotels. Another common space that we're going to understand, but not necessarily realize that we have a different relationship with them, and thus the spirits that are there. Broaden that out to places like prisons. Getting harder to understand, but again, because he set it up so well, the argument really does flow through, and you have far more understanding about your own relationship with these places through the spirits that may or may not inhabit them. This was not the ghost book I was expecting to pick up. And initially, I was sort of disappointed. I did want to freak myself out a little bit. I realize now, maybe that's not what I should be thinking about when it comes to ghosts and spirits. Colin Dickey, well, he's pointed out some issues with my own understanding of ghost tourism and spirits in general. I've always treated them as very personal, but I was a tour guide for a ghost walk. That's not personal. That's taking somebody else's history and, well, making it fit a narrative that you want. A narrative that's relatively harmless. A narrative that might critique a few things, but it certainly doesn't admit to a lot of sins. Thanks to Ghostland, I have a much better understanding of my own relationship with ghosts, whether or not they do exist. Because in some forms they do. We keep these memories alive by telling them. They are stories. But what stories we're telling, that's important too. And we don't always think about it. So, for anyone interested in ghosts, whether or not you believe in them, and if you're super interested in culturally understanding the major issues with the ghost stories that we tell, I would highly recommend Ghostland. This is a fantastic read for a plethora of reasons. Just be prepared to self-reflect on some of the own choices you might have made in regards to understanding spirits yourself. This had me asking a lot of questions, but in a good way. Get ready to confront some skeletons in your closet, and everybody else's, if you choose to read Colin Dickey's Ghostland, An American History in Haunted Places.